Yo! Video games.
What up, dudes? Matt here for YoVideogames, and I'm here with some, I guess, interesting news, or at least it's interesting to a lot of people because it kept popping up on a lot of my social media feeds. And that was Monolith Soft put up a brand new advertising page for a Legend of Zelda game, specifically for a Zelda game. Now, this has got a lot of people thinking, oh my gosh, Monolith Soft's making the new Zelda game, and maybe some people are like, oh, maybe they're doing a spin-off, and then, you know, let's take a step back a little bit, though, and talk about what's actually going on here. So, what I think a lot of people don't know is that Monolith Soft has been working on the Legend of Zelda series since before Skyward Sword, which, again, I guess it's kind of a surprise to some people, but yeah, they actually put up an advertisement, although a much smaller one, a year before Skyward Sword came out, asking for help, for people to help come work on a legendary series, and yeah, they worked on that. They actually, one of their smaller studios helped work on A Link Between Worlds. And here's the thing I think a lot of people don't really get, at least some do, is that 60% of Monolith Soft was working on Breath of the Wild. 60%, and 40% were working on Xenoblade 2, and a lot of Xenoblade 2 actually had to get outsourced to people like Tri-Ace. Remember those guys? They used to make Star Ocean and Valkyrie profile games? Yeah. Anyways, it seemed that after Breath of the Wild and Xenoblade 2 both came out in 2017, which is such a weird statement to make, seems like that they, have gone back into, they're going to make their own games now. Obviously, there were recruitment pages that popped up a year before Xenoblade 2 came out, and it basically showed a medieval fantasy-like setting. There was an armored girl with a dragon in the sky, and then there was a sort of ruins of a castle courtyard with a very Soulsy looking knight just in the middle standing there. And those were pretty cool. They were pretty exciting. There were a bunch of positions opened up, including for character design for this medieval action RPG. Now, this is where people probably jump ahead and say, like, oh, well, that was for Zelda. Okay, hold on. The crazy thing about this news is that if you go to Monolith Soft's website right now, it has three open pages. Now, this also could be explained by Monolith Soft opening a second Tokyo studio last year, so this is probably what they're gearing up to do. So, we now have 3 pages of completely separate projects, one for Zelda, one for an action RPG, and one for the next in the Xenoblade series. So, what we basically can look at from all this is that Monolith Soft right now is obviously going to be making a Xenoblade 3. Some people are probably still hoping for a Xenoblade X2. I don't really think that's going to happen. It could, but I don't think any of the recruitment pages have asked for anyone with any sort of networking or online integration stuff. So to me, that's kind of like a tell right there that they're going forward without any sort of online features in mind, which was something they experimented with Xenoblade X, but either they have them and they don't need anyone for it, or possibly they may do a Xenoblade X2 without any online integration, or maybe where I'm at is like they just may not be doing Xenoblade X2. They might just be moving on to Xenoblade 3. So I'm kind of excited either way. I'm kind of a little bit more in the I enjoy Xenoblade propers more than the X game, but the Xenoblade X is still a really good game. I've always been kind of excited by the action RPG because it wouldn't be the first time that Monolith Soft dipped their toes into an action RPG. They made a very story-driven Diablo clone called Soma Bringer on the 3DS way back in actually I think it was just DS, on the Nintendo DS back in the day. It was a game a lot of people really wanted to come stateside, but the people at even Nintendo of America didn't even know what the fuck it was when asked about it at E3 one time. Thank you, Cammy. But they also did Disaster Day of Crisis, which was just an action game, like a cinematic shoot 'em up. And it was okay. It was pretty good. It was very experimental. And it came from a time when Monolith Soft was a lot smaller, and they were, apparently the morale was really low at the studio at the time, so I guess we wouldn't want to really look at that as any sort of an indication of what they could do with an action game, but a real-time action RPG with their open-world map aesthetic would be pretty cool. I mean, you could almost say that Breath of the Wild practically is a Monolith Soft game, since a lot of their staff made that game, particularly the map and the level design and layout, and that's the best part of Breath of the Wild by far. So that being said, we can deep dive a little bit harder into this by going into who are they looking for the next Legend of Zelda game. And the interesting thing here is that specifically for Legend of Zelda, this is not like tease like a legendary game franchise or anything like that. Like, no, hey, they're putting out the advertisement in Japan that we need people to make the next Legend of Zelda game. And here's a bunch of Legend of Zelda splash artwork on the page itself. But anyways, let's deep dive into it. Now, with Breath of the Wild, they were involved in game design, structural art, production art, dungeon art, landscape art, and landscape modeling. Those last two are important because, again, Monolith Soft, the engine they made for Xenoblade X was used for Breath of the Wild, which makes sense why they were so 60% of them were pulled into Breath of the Wild's development. But yeah, like the last two, landscape modeling and landscape art, like yes, basically they designed that fucking map and then they came up with a lot of the art to put on it. So, and again, I argue heavily that is the absolute best part of Breath of the Wild, was its environment, its map. But here's where it gets a little crazy going forward. So, for the next Legend of Zelda game, Monolith Soft is looking for technical artists. That includes modeling technical artist, rigging artist, and rigging animation, and effects for technical artist effects. They are looking for programmers, which are character control programmers. In other words, like the action parts of it. The tools and development environment programmer. Probably something to do with the physics, I'd imagine, since Breath of the Wild so heavily relied on its physics and interactivity there. A system and framework programmer. That's probably engine, stuff like that. They're looking for planners. They're looking for an action part planner, a level design planner, and a quest planner. So someone to, obviously come up with and develop and implement quests into the game. And there's other people. Level design planner is interesting to me because it's like, does that probably mean dungeons? Maybe like a dungeon designer. That would be super awesome if they brought those back. Speaking of designers, there's a whole section of that Monolith is hiring for. They're looking for a main character designer, which is probably the most mind-blowing part for me. Monolith Soft is possibly taking on the main character design for a Legend of Zelda game. That is fucking nuts. A concept art designer, character modeler, map modeler, which is good, thank God, in-game animator, and event production staff for cutscenes. So they're doing the movies, which is probably a good thing because regardless of how you feel about the dubbing, which is not Monolith, but the actual choreography of the cutscenes in Xenoblade 2 is actually really good. So them hiring to do cutscenes for the next game is pretty cool. And obviously, but doing the artwork, that's crazy to me. And then they're looking for a project manager, which is pretty important. That's probably like the most highest end position they're looking for a Zelda game. This is really nuts to me because this is almost as if they are designing the whole goddamn game. What is missing here, though, is they're not looking for producers, they're not looking for directors. They're not really looking for a lot of just general game design elements at all, like structure and stuff like that. And they're not looking for anything more nitty-gritty technical either, for stuff like item designer or stuff like that. A lot of it is mostly programming and art, but that's still obviously a big part of the game. There's nothing about music, there's nothing about story, which means to me that I honestly think that this is what's probably happening here, is that Nintendo EAD2 is probably still kind of overseeing the general overall structure of the game, the story of the game. They're probably still handling the music themselves, but they're basically relying more and more on Monolith Soft to implement it. And I think there's a pretty good reason for that. And I think that's because EAD2 is probably not that big of a studio or development part of EAD or EPD, whatever they call themselves nowadays. So I think the reality is that they're mostly just the idea guys now, and they're relying probably more and more on Monolith Soft and their sort of expertise and their know-how, especially when it comes to open world design, open world, like making artwork and seamlessness, and cutscenes as well, because there weren't a lot of cutscenes in Breath of the Wild. They weren't all that great. Even when they were there, they were just kind of okay. But yeah, it's really interesting that they're taking on so many different hats or so many different jobs for the next Legend of Zelda game, much more than even Breath of the Wild. And part of me thinks that this is probably what the whole entirety of the new studio that they opened for Monolith Soft is probably doing. It's probably the all majority of that. And then the other two teams from the original Tokyo studio are probably working on that action RPG and Xenoblade 3. Now, the timetable for this gets kind of wonky because some people are, and I've heard rumblings that should be the next Zelda game next fall, 2020. So that's like a year and a half away, which you might think, well, that's way fucking too soon, but you know, that'll be 3.5 years after Breath of the Wild. Possibly even more, because Breath of the Wild was probably more or less done at the end of 2016, and they were just holding it back, obviously, for the Switch. I'm not saying completely done, but probably mostly done. So it'll be like close to 4 years by the time we get to fall 2020, which to me would be kind of the ripe prime time for, you know, basically I'm saying it would be easy for there to be a new Legend of Zelda ready to go in fall 2020. The other thing we also have to remember is that Monolith Soft is probably one of the most efficient Japanese developers in the industry right now. So for them to have even 2 games ready to go in 2020 is really not any giant stretch of the imagination. If we look back at it, like Xenoblade 2 only really took about 2 years to come out because, again, Breath of the Wild came out, you know, early 2017, but like Xenoblade X came out in Japan at the end of April 2015, and then they started hiring after sometime in the summer of 2015, and then December 2017, Xenoblade 2 was out. So they had thought up and developed and made Xenoblade 2 in 2.5 or less years. Roughly 2.5 years, just a little bit under that. And that was a big game with a lot of content in it. And I imagine that, you know, 2 years after Xenoblade 2 wraps, considering that they were hiring and working on the medieval action RPG sometime in 2016, that's also to me is like, okay, well, yeah, they'd be ready to go by 2020. So again, you know, we go back to 3 years from the end of 2017 to 2020. I have no doubt that Monolith Soft could easily have one of their next games ready to go. And again, all of this, of course, would probably be before one fucking part of Final Fantasy VII Remake gets released. So, yes, I am slinging that mud. It's just a funny irony to me that I just can't help but bring up. I'm such a bad boy. Anyways, though, this is all interesting news for me. I don't know how interesting it is for you, but yeah, I just kind of wanted to put out there that, yeah, Monolith Soft's been making Zelda games for quite some time. This isn't actually all that new, but what is interesting is how much of the studio is going to be working on the next Legend of Zelda game specifically, and that, yes, they do have 3 hiring pages for 3 separate projects. So that's all pretty cool. Let me know what you guys think, and if you would like to see either just another collaboration like Breath of the Wild, would you like to see a spin-off, or would you like to see a fucking mainline Zelda game developed entirely by Monolith Soft? I'm kind of down for any of them. So yeah, they all sound good to me, but I think it's more than likely that just Monolith Soft's just taking on more duties in the next Legend of Zelda game. But yeah, let me know what you guys think, and I'll see you on the channel. Later, dudes.